All right, we are live here. Finally, it's been a day of technical issues, uh, but I think we're live here. And I'm here with Elizabeth Lynn Blackson, and we're going to talk about Old Black Water, the brand new book that came out today. And
Yes.
so say hi.
Hello. I'm terribly. I can't even express how excited I am. Um, when we released the first book, A Girl's Got to Eat, 8 months ago, it was sort of a. I don't know if it's going to have an audience or get any traction, and it seems like it's still gaining readers and following and kind of really starting to spread. And so I am both kind of excited and terrified for the second one.
Yeah, terror is normal, I think.
Yes.
But you already have three reviews, and all three reviews are fives, and people love it so far. So
Yes, so
that's a good.
far.
That's
This
a good.
book particularly was nerve wracking to me because it is like if you write horror or that sort of thing, there are places where you can go that is so brutally dark. You wonder if you're going to drive off people, even people who like horror. And I did that at one point in my book where I was writing it and I thought, I'm going to hell for this. you know and it's like I really hope I don't lose my readers at this one point in the book. So
I think I know what you're talking about.
it involves a soldering iron, if that
Yeah,
tells you
yeah, yeah,
anything.
yeah. That whole scene, which is actually two chapters, was really hard for me to get through the first time.
Yes.
But the second time through, wasn't nearly as bad. I don't know if I was desensitized to it, but it is pretty brutal. I will say that this book, I think, is more true horror in a lot of ways than the first one was.
Yeah, I think it in calling the series urban fantasy horror, it is both more urban fantasy, there's more fantasy elements, and it's definitely more horror. So yeah.
Yeah, you get into a lot of folk horror almost in it, which with a lot of the Native American mythology stuff.
Yes.
Um,
Stuff that's right down the hill from where I live, like 3 miles away, is the Cahokia Mounds, which gets brought up in the story, and the Southern Ceremonial Complex, which was sort of the religious uh, belief system that, as far as archaeologists can piece together, that was followed by the people in Cahokia. The artwork of Cahokia, their copper work, which is something that you never learn about, or I never learned about until a few years ago, that there was extensive copper work in North America and bronze work in South America, which is kind of surprising. So,
and I only learned about it when I read it in the book.
right, right. I just had someone read my book the other day, and because I bring up this statue, Degas' Little Dancer in the first book, and they just learned about the statue. I think the history of the statue from that book, and followed that lead into learning more about it. And that's kind of a fun thing when people can take elements from my story that are real world stuff, and it connects them to new knowledge and new information.
Right, and let's just going back to the first one for a minute. There's something interesting about that. Um, there was the church that you mentioned in that one, which is a real abandoned church,
Right.
and you found out more about that church after the first book came out. Why don't you talk a little bit about
Right.
that?
Well, I thought that it was like good and gone, just an abandoned building that was never going to have anything more happen with it. And then I found out that there was an effort to restore it. There was a .org where they were trying to. I think it's St. Augustine. If you give me a moment, I can look it up. It's in my notes. Well, it's in my notes, but I can't find it. I think it was called staugustine.org. I believe that was the name of the church. It's a real church, described as I mentioned it in the first book, with the copper guttering has been stripped off, and the windows are covered with OSB, and it's just a mess. but it was a beautiful building, and there was a theme sort of through the whole first book of St. Louis being made of brick and being made of red earth, and this church even was made of brick, which is usually I think of them as the larger stone, larger solid stones. This one was made of red brick. Beautiful building. This org got founded, and then in December of this past year, the church was set ablaze. It was caught on fire, and they don't know if it's salvageable at this point. So,
Oh, that's a shame.
yeah, and it's really sad because it was a beautiful old building, and it would be nice to see it restored. But there's a point where there's not much to be done. So
Right.
hopefully it will come back around and be a place for the community to gather, and not infested by demons, by the way.
Right. Right. That's important to mention.
Yes. There
Um,
are no real, as to the best of my knowledge, there are no demons in that church.
or
Don't go
perhaps
to
in
the,
the entire world, really. We
well,
don't know
yeah,
for sure, but
I have personally never encountered a demon. So.
neither have I, and I've never seen any good evidence that they exist, but they certainly do in the books.
Yes.
Which I don't know. Maybe for the sake of anyone who watches this who hasn't read the first book, maybe you want to just give them a little bit of a synopsis of the first one, and then sort of go into where the second one picks up.
Sure. Spoiler alert for the first book, A Girl's Gotta Eat. The story revolves around two characters in the first book. Agent Javier Torres is an FBI agent on the trail of a serial killer. The second major character, and probably the primary character in the book, her name is Madison Lucy Carpenter. She goes by Lucy. She's had a terrible childhood, um, and in her mid-20s, she's trying to figure out how to be a functioning adult. She is saved from being attacked by a couple guys are trying to attack her. She's saved by this mysterious woman who they sort of bond, and it turns out that this mysterious woman is the serial killer that Javier Torres is searching for. She is also a shape-shifting, soul-sucking succubus. She turns into a very monstrous form as sort of what would probably be called her native form. Um, Meanwhile, a new partner is assigned to Torres to hunt down the serial killer, and it turns out to be another daemon, another shape-shifting monster. And both of the daemons are after this MacGuffin. It's a cross that is actually like a machine that allows them to open a portal to get back home. And by the end of the book, Torres is put in a position where he has to decide whether or not the few people that this daemon, the female daemon, kills are worth the cost of their lives compared to the damage that these people are doing, because the people she's killing turned out to be very terrible people. The book ends with both Lucy and Torres just beaten mercilessly. They're just like hospitalized, and they only succeed in beating the second daemon by the help of the female one. So there's this uneasy truce between Torres and the daemon. That's the first book. There's also a line in the first book where the daemon is talking to Lucy and says, "I don't think she likes me." And Lucy says, "Who do you mean?" And the daemon says, "The river." The second book comes around to that very, it's a major part of the second story, is the animistic forces of the world, of the real material world, start to bend their will against the daemons who are sort of encroaching into our reality. We see that as one part of it. We see a second part of it, which is um, the agents of the daemons, because you can get power from these creatures. Um, those agents, those people who want that power, want they know that Lucy knows the name of this daemon. She's a friend, and are trying to get that information from her. So, is that good?
Yeah, I think that's pretty good. Yeah, the second one is definitely darker and more horror than the first one, I think. So,
And one of my readers that is pretty much the first person who reads anything that I write commented that part of the horror, a big part of the horror, is not shape-shifting monsters and soul sucking and all that. It's the horrible things that humans do to other humans.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. And I think you know what, any good story that involves some sort of otherworldly entity like that, there always needs to be some conflict between the humans, and some of the
Right.
humans have to. I mean, it's in all the great stories that are like that. So,
It's and it's like Godzilla movies where, yeah, it's neat to see a monster stomp through the city, but it doesn't matter if you don't care about the inhabitants of the city and the damage being done.
exactly, and I mean, I think even back to like the second, well, both Alien movies,
Yes.
both the first two Alien movies. That was the human factor was a huge part of
Right.
what enabled the creatures, and a lot of the horror in those wouldn't have happened had it not been for the
Greed.
humans involved. Yeah, greed.
Yeah, greed.
And in fact, in Old Black Water, it is greed of a sort. It's a greed for power, not for
Yes.
money, but for power. And that, and not even for one of the characters, one of the human characters. I don't know. It's necessarily from my reading of it. I don't know. It's necessarily power, but more. It reminded me a little bit of Hellraiser in the experience and
Yes. Yes.
that sort of a thing.
I know the character you're talking about. I'm guessing it's Eric.
Yes, and
Yeah.
it's more about sensation for him.
It's
An
his
experience.
motivation. As you read lines of what's going through his head, it's like, what what's wrong with this guy? There's something seriously messed up with him. His viewpoint of the world is so twisted. Yeah, he was from he was born as the villain of the second book from a really small part in the first book, but all of the things that come in the second book, the injuries to Torres that you see really affecting him in the second book, because he is at the end of the first book, he's smashed in the face with a rifle and it breaks his face. And in the second book, he's having the sort of things you would expect if you took that kind of concussion damage. And he's an older guy and he's not recovering as fast. And he's feeling his age through the whole book and it's kind of wearing him apart. Lucy, who is younger, also suffered a lot of damage, and she even has some remnant, um, not just scarring, but actual functional problems from the injuries. And they start kind of, I mean, you watch stuff like Batman where he's beaten unconscious every third episode, and you're like, why is this guy not dead?
Yeah,
I'd like to think that my characters are wearing more appropriately to the amount of suffering that they take, which I think actually that the word suffering is something that gets covered eventually. Why this is called the suffering sequence as a trilogy. Um, there's a part where the character Greg, who is a artist craftsman, makes things, considers himself like a basement troll. He's got Greg has a very hard view of himself, but at one point he's trying to cheer up Lucy and says something about it's your art, and she says, "Yeah, it's the art of suffering." So,
yeah, I caught that. That was a nice little reference.
which is where I took the suffering sequence from. Is that line? It comes back in the third book. There's a chapter called "The Art of Suffering."
Nice. I like how you weave things like art, like physical art, and
Right.
also music heavily into the story too.
Right, music, because Torres, part of his path from the first book into the second book, it mentions that he's listening to classic rock and almost kind of torturing another character by playing classic rock that they don't like. Um, but he's the kind of person that cues music up in his head. Whenever he has a scene in his life, he's got the rock song to play as sort of soundtrack. And through the whole story, he's picking up vibes that he doesn't understand, and the only way his brain can translate them is as rock songs. So he gets snippets of, like, he doesn't know why this song or that song is playing, but they're playing in his head, uh, like they're being broadcast or pushed. So yes, a lot of rock, a lot of musical reference in this book.
which of course I love.
The,
I tend to put a lot of musical reference in a lot of the stuff I write too. So
I wrote the very closing scene of this book, um, and I wrote it and I wasn't happy with it. It ended sort of weirdly emotionally for me, and I tried it a couple times. This is the first time I've rewritten something more than once, where it was like that doesn't work and that doesn't work. The closing scene ends with Torres getting a song in his head, kind of projected from one of the characters. And I couldn't believe how well the lyrics matched up with the story I was telling. It's like, that was not intended, but boy, did it work well. I mentioned in the first book at the very beginning, the introduction, that the first seed of an idea for Lucy as a character came from the song "Knocking at Your Back Door" by Deep Purple, and I reference it in the story in the second book. So yeah, a lot of rock stuff in it.
well, and I remember this one was a little different too from the first process in that after it came to me and I did my first proof run, and you took it back, you actually rearranged some stuff and redid some stuff in it, which you didn't do with the first one. So that was kind of different. Yeah, the funny thing is, it was the rearranging was so organic to me that
Mm-hmm.
when I read it the second time, I didn't even see what you had done. It just seemed
Yeah,
natural to me.
yeah. There was a problem. I was trying to do a thing where there's a scene in the middle of the book. It's sort of the big action piece in the first half of the book. Um, and I was trying to follow individual characters through the scene and then back up and show it from a different character's point of view, and it wasn't working. And I had to re-edit, remesh the scene so that they showed this bit of this character and this bit of this character, so it made more sense.
Yeah, and like I said, it was organic enough that I didn't notice the difference from first to second. So
And this is something I'm excited about. Was I've never done editing like A Girl's Gotta Eat is the most extensive editing I had done to date. And then now this book is more heavily edited than the first, as far as changes after it got out of my hands initially. And I'm starting to learn that you have better and worse storytelling, and it's never perfect and it's never totally garbage, but I'm starting to see the ways where it can be improved. So as a crafts person, as an author, I guess, I feel like this book probably pushed me more than anything I've written recently. So, and
that's
that's partially due to you and your feedback, so thanks for that.
oh yeah, absolutely. And you know what? When we're working together on a book like that, the way I look at it is we're trying to create the best possible version of it we can. You
Right.
know, and I try as much as possible to let your vision can stay untouched, but sometimes it just makes sense to do some things a little differently, or and also I think one thing that I've always found is even with my own writing, sometimes if I'll send that to someone else, something that may be 100% clear in my mind when I write it and when I read it, somebody else might read it and not understand what's going on. Now, I can't think of any instances where yours was like that, but I think that's one of the purposes of having another person read something. And I
Mm-hmm.
know with the Music Street Journal stuff, when I've edited it, my thought is always, sometimes the writers will tell me, well, I meant this with it. I said, okay, that's fine. But the problem is, if I read it the wrong way, I'm not the only one who's going to read it the wrong way. We
Mm-hmm.
should fix it so it's more clear, because you want it to be as clear as possible to as many people as possible.
Right. And there are people who will, no matter how blatantly you spell something out, they won't catch it. And no matter how subtly you say something, they'll catch it. And then there's another group that will see things that you never intended. And sometimes that's good, and sometimes it's like, oh no, that's not what I meant at all. So It's fun. It's fun to see that from different readers, where you start to understand that effect.
Well, it's funny. I mean, even myself, like when I wrote the Homestead, and I didn't even get it when I wrote it. It wasn't intentional, but when I read it over, because I was getting ready to do an interview about it, and when I read it over again, I suddenly saw some themes in there that I had never picked up on. And I'm like, my God, those are very clear. And
Mm-hmm.
how did I not get that was in like the three home invaders in that are almost a dysfunctional family unit, and I had never seen it until I read it afterwards. So it was completely unintentional, but yet it was there. So maybe was my subconscious putting it there? So like you say, when people see things that you never intended, did part of you actually put it there and you just didn't realize it, or is it just that you're picking up on it?
Right, right. There was something that I mentioned in the first book, again, regarding the Degas statue of a little dancer, where she looks at it at one point and then someone tells her something about the statue, and it's like she sees it differently. It's the exact same piece of artwork, but now she projects meaning into it that wasn't there before. And I think you can see that with your when you write something, you can see it too. Is depending on what people know or their experience, they bring things in and see different perspectives on the same scene or the same character.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the thing with any piece of art. Everybody is going to see it completely differently than everybody else, because
Yeah.
we all come at it with our own experiences, our own things that we are attracted to or have experienced, and those things are going to be reflected in how we perceive something.
So there was something that I was going to mention, and I don't want it to be too spoilery for people who haven't read the second book or even after they've read the second book. But there's a sort of theme that is lightly described, mostly comes through with Lucy, where there's a separation between the profane and the celestial, or profane and sacred, or however you want to say it. Um, and that comes through again and again in the story. The difference between sort of what we are told by higher powers, or what we are expected by people telling us what higher powers want, and the truth of being trapped in a material flesh body, and what you have to do to survive, and the suffering of that flesh kind of thing, which is part of the whole concept of suffering sequence. I was going to call it the Samsara sequence, and felt that was a little pretentious even for me. So
I think it would have been a little obscure for a lot of people too.
yeah, but it is.
I would have had to look that up.
But it is. Samsara is sort of in the Eastern Buddhist, I think. There's a word for Buddhism and some other religions that are related to it, but in Vedic, something like that, religions, there's a concept of samsara, which is if you're alive and in a mortal body, suffering. So it's sort of that, and Lucy is the embodiment of physical suffering in the story. So
And mental suffering, and
the mental suffering comes from the physical suffering. Somebody who is in theory um, awakened to a high enough level could ignore all of the suffering of the body.
right.
She is
Which,
not.
yeah. Although she has moments.
She has the thing is, see, I don't know how much spoilery stuff.
That's why I was very careful about what I said, because
There are, even in the first book, but more so in the second book, there are moments where the higher Lucy simply demands something of her body that is like, that's not possible. That's not, and it's like, I didn't ask you if it was possible. You're going to do it. So,
which I mean, there are instances, you always hear of instances where people can do that kind of thing too.
right.
Like you hear about the mother who will lift some incredibly heavy thing off their child, and So those things are. I think what it comes down to is we don't really understand just what our bodies are capable of because we put restraints on it to protect ourselves.
Right.
When you come to a point where it's like, I can't hold anything back. Everything's got to
Yep.
go into this.
Yep. It's
I
like
think
there
that's
are
what to.
like there are safety catches that say don't exceed this. The old Star Trek thing. You'll tear the ship apart. Well, there are times when you just push it past the safe limit because you
Yeah,
have to.
because you don't have the option for the safe limit. Yeah,
Yep. Yep.
I think that's probably how it actually works in real life.
Yep. I agree with that. There was something I was going to say and it fell out of my ear. So let's move right along. This book takes a lot of the secondary characters we see from the first book, brings them back, and gives them a more important role. There was one character in particular from the first book, Latanya, who I very much wanted to shoehorn into the first story, but I couldn't make it work as far as the story goes. She has medical experience. She's a trauma medic, and she was that portion of her character was specifically done because if you have a team of people who are going to be chewed up by monsters, you probably want someone there to patch you up. And I couldn't make it work in the first book the way the book ended. It would just be weird for her to show up on the scene that was, you know, 70 cops surrounding a church building, and I couldn't see her slipping in somehow, sneaking in to help anybody. So it's like she didn't get used to the degree that I wanted to use her. You get to see um, her organizational skills, her ability to stay calm in really horrible situations, and she's just you see like she is a trained military person, Marine turned Navy medic, and it kicks into that gear of other people. Even the main investigator, Javier Torres, is not nearly so prepared for horrible stuff as she is. And it was great bringing her in. There's a character, Greg, who is madly in love with Lucy, and he's just a schlub and he hates himself, but he's amazing in very particular ways and kind of doesn't see it. Um, and his arc through the second book is maybe my favorite as far as building someone toward becoming like a hero or that sort of thing. Um, who else? There was a character, DeMarco, she was very minor in she has one scene in the first book. She shows up as a secondary character in the first book, shows up more in the second. And introducing one new character, David Pruitt. I didn't mention this, but David Pruitt's last name, Pruitt, there was when they were doing the projects like buildings in the 60s, there was one in St. Louis, a very famous one called Pruitt Igo, and it was it went bad, and it's a big demolished flat level piece of ground now, much like the portions of St. Louis I describe in the first book, where it's block after block of nothing. It's just been razed, um, just leveled.
They
Uh,
haven't gentrified that stuff yet.
what's that?
They haven't gentrified it.
No, it's empty, just
Oh,
empty,
that's
empty,
weird.
empty. Yeah,
'Cause I'm used to. I mean, I've never been to St. Louis. I've been to Chicago a lot, and Chicago's great on taking those old areas
yeah,
and raising them, and then just putting luxury buildings like where Cabrini Green used to be is all
yeah.
luxury buildings and stuff now, and it's like it's
I'll
all
I'll get I'll get back to that in a minute, but the reason I brought up the name Pruitt is through that Pruitt Igo was named. The name Pruitt comes from one of the Tuskegee Airmen of World War II. So I wanted with his name to make a statement that like a name can be vilified and and made heroic sort of at the same time, depending on what you know about it. It's much like the statue where what it means matters greatly as to what you know about its history. So, David Pruitt, that character, is an ex-Marine whose life is in shambles. He is I think the phrase fuck up is probably a good way to say it, and is having a hard time dealing with certain issues. He gets kind of knocked on the head a little bit, has some sense knocked into him about mid-book, but his discomfort and the problems that he deals with are very one of the things I had a lot of fun. Some of my favorite lines came from David. There's one where he shakes someone's hand after that person had sex with an escort, and he thinks to himself, "You best have fucking washed that thing." And I just every time I read it, I'm like, that joke is good. I'm standing with that one. You go ahead. You say something.
No, I was gonna say one of the things I like too is that you've got this bunch of ragtag misfits who organize really well into like a unit that works so well,
Yes.
and that's actually a really common thing in fiction, but it's common, I think, because it works so well. It's a trope that really works.
Right. You have to have the right amount of tension in a group to make ensemble work, I think. If everybody gets along, then it's like have you ever watched a movie where the fighter pilots or the space pilot is yelling and frantic, and then you see real world fighter pilots and it's all just like, yeah, we're about to die, and they're just dead calm about it, you know? It's like
Yeah,
that. It's great in the real world. It's terrible for drama. So you have to have the right amount of drama in a group.
yeah, and like I said, I think that's. I mean, and I like the whole. They're really an amateur group, which is they're an amateur group who play on all the strengths of the people, which again, and some of my liking that probably goes back to when I was a kid. I read a ton of Doc Savage books, and I don't know if you've read any of those, but Doc was like he could do everything. He was like a Superman almost.
Yeah.
But his cohorts they all had their own specialty, and so you had different guys who could do different things, and they all worked well as a team because each person had their skill set that complemented everybody else's, even though they often didn't get along very well.
Yeah, yeah. And that's a fun thing for me to do, is trying to build sort of make it feel organic, where I'm looking at it from different perspectives, like how do these characters interact, but also if you're trying to build a team of people who can fight an encroachment of shapeshifting daemons, what sort of specialties do you need to get that done, and how do you best prepare for it? And one of the jokes that gets thrown starts in the first book, but through the second, is budget. Where's the budget for saving the world coming from? Are we going to get a budget? Am I going to get the character Javier Torres at the beginning? His friend tells him that his breakfast is being comped. They're going to like a donut shop, and it's like, breakfast is free, and he's like, yes, that's how poor you are. Something else about like the character David saying something about the poor signage used by the group. Like, this is really unprofessional.
Yeah. Do you want to talk a little bit about where without any spoilers, what happens in the third book, which obviously I haven't seen yet?
The third book comes to a head. They know that there are greater daemons in the world, and at some point someone says, I think there might be 9 of them. There's a sort of several mysterious groups operating that you don't see. You see a little bit of one of them in the second book, where one of the characters, who's been called Eric through the whole thing, is suddenly referred to as Mr. 19 by someone else. And the person who calls him Mr. 19 is himself called Mr. 12. Well, what the hell's all that about? Well, it explains what that's about. It explains about some of the things that they've been facing. and it is I'm going to call it the official formation of their team as a logo branded. We have a name for our group now. It is the culmination of a couple storylines. There has been an ongoing storyline with Lucy and her mother, which gets completed in the third book. I can't really go into more without spoilers. Are you still there? Gary, we frozen? Hello? Hello? Are we back?
Yeah, the technical issues continue. What is up with today? My USB port stopped working.
Well, what'd you do that for?
What's that?
I said, what'd you do that for?
Oh, I don't know.
So where was I? Something terribly exciting. The book is wonderful.
Yeah, and we have been plagued with technical issues too.
It's just going to be one of those days. It's just going to, that's all right. One of the things that I realized was everything, like the books are going to have errors in them, and there's nothing I can do about that. No matter how hard we try, some little errors are going to slip in.
Oh yeah,
and
absolutely.
We have to sort of be comfortable with imperfection, which I'm not comfortable. That's terrible.
But I mean, I've always said this: if you go buy any book first printing, I don't care what company it comes from. These big companies have a team of proofreaders going over it, not just two people like you and I doing it. They have 15, 20 people going over it multiple times, and you'll still find typos in them.
Yeah.
You're never going to get them all. Yeah. The only ones that don't have them all are when they've been in print, for many years, and maybe on the 15th reprint they get the final one out of there. And then even then, who knows?
Yeah, in the next version they introduce new ones, right?
Exactly. So it's like you've just got to accept that. You get as much as you can, and you're happy with it, I guess.
Yeah,
as happy as you're going to be.
So, do you have any questions for me about this book or the series up to date? Up to this date?
I think we've pretty much covered everything I had. That's all I can come up with, I think. Is there anything else you wanted to chat about?
I can't really think of anything. I did use, unlike the first book where I tried to avoid proper names of products and places and things like that, I did in at least one case mention a business specifically by name, and I got their permission to do so before I used it. A place called Mystic Valley in St. Louis, which is an alternate religion shop, has like candles and tarot cards and crystals and singing bowls and incense and that sort of thing. And I got their permission to use the name of their shop. And I think, honestly, the way the shop is framed in the story is not, I don't cast it in a disparaging light in any way or anything like that. So I would just like to say thank you to Mystic Valley. Go buy all your crystals and stuff from them.
I've done that in some of my stories too. It's like if you're going to actually use a real place, you contact them, you say, hey, here's what I want to do. And I've actually usually shown them what I was doing with it, the section where they were talked about ahead of time. So I'd say, here's what I'm doing. And I find most of the time they're pretty happy about it as long as you're putting in a good light.
As long as you're not painting people with because as alternate spiritual traditions, you could really, it's like the whole, witches are terrible, cackling, evil things. Like people writing fantasy could do a hatchet job on alternate spiritual beliefs, and I didn't want that to happen. So that's all I had to say about that.
No, I think you did it. I think they're probably pretty pleased with it. I think they will be anyway. They were presented well, I think. Um, and it's like, you know what? If I were in St. Louis, I'd probably stop by there and say hi.
I have a I'm going to call it an addiction to shiny rocks, like polished stones. I don't know why. And it's like it doesn't matter to me so much that if they're supposed to have particular properties like supernatural properties or spiritual properties. I don't care. I like shiny rocks. I like neat looking. As a kid, when you pick up a rock and it maybe has a fossil in it and you take it home, it's like, why did you pick up a rock? Well, because I don't
It's
know.
cool.
It's a neat rock. Yeah, it's a neat rock. What do you want from me? Um, there's a thing that carries on from the first book into the second, which is talking about copper and verdigris. It becomes much more prominent in the same way I was talking about how Lucy is the sort of flesh here, reality, tangible sort of thing, as opposed to supernatural or spiritual or whatever. Copper in my story is that representation of the impermanent but always um, rejuvenating sort of cycle. Uh, and then I got to look up if you have copper, what sort of precious stones can come along with it. And so, like, looking up all the gemstones that could have been found. So that was kind of fun, and finding where there was actual copper mines in my vicinity. That was a neat little bit of research I got to do. So that was fun.
Yeah, I like how you research this stuff too. It's funny. I've never had a problem with you on this, but on some other people, occasionally I've had to double check them because I'm sort of a stickler for if you mention something like that, um, you know, I want to make sure that it fits, and
You found an error in the first book. I don't know of a factual problem.
I
Which
remember that
yeah. So
because
it's
I
like that's
Googled
not
it.
right, Lynn. And I'm like, it's not because Tom Harris wrote that, and he's pretty.
I know.
Okay, fine, fine,
I,
whatever. I won't use it.
I remember that, and I've spotted a few things. Somebody who I won't mention had something about it was a story set, a period story, and he mentioned a song or something, and I looked it up, and it's like, dude, that song wasn't released for a couple more years. We got a problem
Yeah,
here. So
yeah,
I do tend to look up stuff like that and check facts like that because I want to make sure. I do it in my own stuff too. I'm constantly looking up stuff to make sure. Okay, when was this invented? In
yeah.
fact, it ends in the graveyard,
Mm-hmm,
which I don't know if you've read it, but I know I sent it to you, but I don't know if you've read
mm-hmm.
it. But the narrator is kind of a smartass who's a writer, and they are kind of a smartass, and at one point they mentioned something about Elon Musk's flamethrower that wasn't a flamethrower, and then they're like, okay, I really didn't say that because no one really knew who Elon Musk was then, and his boring company wasn't going to be around for another couple decades, but I wish I'd said that.
Yeah, yeah. There was because I wrote the first book in this series in 2017, I think. And this one I wrote in either 2018 or 2019. So it's been a while, and sometimes particularly the musical reference thing, there's a song in there that I had to see if it existed when it gets mentioned. It's like, okay, well yeah, and those little details where people will call you out on them once they figure out you're wrong. And once again, we're not perfect, and we're all humans, and
Well, another thing you do, which is something I'm very fond of doing, is when you were talking about the names having specific references and meanings. I do a lot of that myself, and I don't know if anyone ever picks up on any of it. But a lot of times, like with my stories, if you look up the meanings of names, it tells you a lot about what and who that character is.
yeah.
I don't do it all the time, but I'm trying to think. I think there's a story I've got coming out pretty soon, and it's basically a retelling of Little Red Riding Hood,
Hmm.
and I can't remember what the character's first name is, but it literally means red.
Mm.
And she's driving a Dodge Equus, which of course is a horse, so she's riding. You know? And so I throw little things like that in there, and I don't know if anybody ever catches them. In It Ends in the Graveyard, one of the victims' name is Clay Shaw, and I looked that name up, and both parts of that name mean something like victim or something. There's another character whose name he loses his head, and his name literally says one of the meanings is someone who gets decapitated.
Yeah.
So like I use those names for a reason.
There's a character in the second book whose name is analyzed like that. And the really weird part when I named the character in the first book, that was not intended in any way, shape, or form. I picked a name that sounded good to me, and then it just sort of got woven like, hey, wait, I could play with this little faction. Yeah, so it was like, okay, this is pretty funny. The way things sort of by serendipity happened, and that was pretty fun. Yeah, there are a couple names in the book that I intended to have meaning. In the first book, I have a character named Jaeger, and I thought that was pretty obvious, but means hunter in like depending on how it's spelled. I spelled it with Yeager, so it wasn't quite as obvious as Jager.
Oh,
Um,
that's I was and that's like one of my recurring characters in some of my stories is a vampire, and one of his names that he goes by is Hunter Fleischer, and Fleischer means butcher.
yeah.
So it's like, yeah, the name tells you exactly what he is.
Have you seen the series Scrubs, the uh,
I've, I've seen
comedy
some
series?
episodes of it.
The JD has a character he made up named Dr. Acula, Dracula, and I'm
Dracula,
like, okay,
yeah,
that's pretty funny. Okay,
that is
yeah,
good.
all of my characters' names don't have a deeper meaning. Some of them do, and then some of them are assigned names. People, Javier Torres names the daemon that they sort of are in association with, and her name is to him a scientific classification. He's trying to figure her out as a life form or a species, and he keeps trying to Torres is really good through the whole series of like, this is what my idea is. No, I was wrong. Okay, now this is the next one. He doesn't give up, but he's frequently wrong. But he's just so doggedly determined to keep at something.
Well,
So
I get the impression that to some degree, the way he deals with horrifying things is by trying to classify them
yes,
and give them names that classify them, and that way he can wrap his head around it.
right. He's
Whereas
trying
he'd
to
be
make
losing
sense
his
of
mind if he didn't, you know.
right, right. He's trying to make sense of a world that is nonsense compared to what he's known to this point.
Yeah,
And
and I think that's actually a really cool detail about the character. It really tells you a lot about him the way he does that.
yeah, there are times when, as you're writing a character, certain aspects of them sort of come to light without necessarily you're trying to make it that way. Um, in the second book, early on, I say that Torres has a minor in zoology, which plays into the story a couple different ways. But one of them is, why do you keep trying to name this creature? Why did you name her Vespid in the first book? And then, as the story progresses, how things change. And his whole, yeah, it's very scientific the way he's trying to break everything down and understand things in a world that poor guy's being bombarded with nonsensical stuff through the whole book. And he says at one point, sorry I wasn't any help. I've been bleeding all over the metro area or something like that. Yes, haven't been real useful, just leaving DNA everywhere.
I like how the characters they all seem like real people, you know. And
I appreciate that.
I told you this, but I've never told and I never mentioned it to anybody else. But at one point when I was working on proofing this the first time through, I literally had a dream with some of those characters in it. I was hanging out with them. I
Yeah.
woke up. I was like,
Now,
"Oh man, I'm in your book."
yeah, and I have that to this day. I've written the 3 books and part of a fourth, and they keep popping up into my head. And like they'll get into arguments. 2 of the characters will get into an argument, and I'm like, would you please take that elsewhere? It's just I've got enough weirdness going on up here. I don't need you guys in here arguing. And then you get I've met a couple readers who say, particularly, this is really funny to me. People are shipping my characters, putting them in love relationships, and they're coming up with some combos that are just like, oh no, where did you come up with that? No. So
Well,
I find it pretty funny. Love life and sex life in my series tends to go badly, like badly. So
I was going to say when you were talking about how they'll have an argument or whatever. I remember Gene Roddenberry talking at one point about how what he liked to do was when he would create a character, he would ask questions of the character to get to know the character and what that character was made of. And he said Spock was the only character that ever asked him questions.
that's nice. That's a great trait for a science officer, don't you think?
Yeah, exactly. He's like, it was the only
Curiosity of
character who ever started asking me questions and making me think about things.
you start worrying about that when you're particularly if they start giving you therapy.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, characters need to be alive in your mind in order to write them. And they do sort of, I think a lot of non-writers don't understand that sometimes you don't know what's going to happen exactly in a book. You have ideas of what's going to
Yeah.
happen, but sometimes the characters have a mind of their own. Once you create a character, it's like, it's like playing a role-playing game. It's exactly like playing
Yes.
a role-playing game, really.
Yeah.
Once you get into a character, that character is going to sometimes do things that you wouldn't actually do.
Yeah. Unexpected.
I remember, yeah, I remember one time I had a character who was a Klingon who wound up in a Dungeons and Dragons world, and he was standing there fighting against a vampire who, from his point of view, was nothing but a regular human being. He's looking at it thinking, this is just a regular human. And I was like, he really ought to back away now because he's going to get killed. But I thought, no, that's me thinking. This character would not do that. He will stand there and fight. And he did. He got killed. And sometimes the characters have to do what the characters have to do to be themselves.
Yeah.
And you don't see it coming, really, sometimes, as the writer.
There is this is not going to be a spoiler, I hope, but there is a point in the 3rd book where a character comes to that where it's sort of their sense of self-preservation versus their primary drive, and the primary drive is like, that's what you gotta do what you gotta do. So
Yeah.
yeah, this book makes me nervous where it goes. The 3rd book makes me nervous where it goes. So I hope people like it. I hope it really is, because I had a friend of mine read this, and he said that he has a steady diet of Stephen King novels, and he said I had to stop reading this at one point because it really hit me viscerally. This one scene just really bugged me,
Was
and
it
I'm
the
like,
same thing that bothered me?
yeah, it's always that scene. It's always that scene.
I literally had to walk away from it for a couple of weeks. But when I'm reading it, I'm proofing at the same time, and that I'm probably reading it at a deeper level than your average reader is.
Yeah.
So it really got to me. I had to walk away. I mean, I literally was in a foul mood from it for a little while.
Yeah. But okay. So the thing is, though, that's horrible. There's a horrible thing that happens sort of first act, I guess, and then midway in the book, there's a turn of fortune for that character. How powerful was that moment, though? And by the way, you were saying sometimes it's not characters, sometimes it's not plot, sometimes it's just a little moment that you want to see in the book. there's a moment that was very clear in my head where Lucy is standing in a curtain of blood. It's just dripping
Excuse me.
all around her. And I'm like, I want to put that image in my book. And it's like, ooh, that kind of bugged me. I get goosebumps. That's kind of terrifying. There was that, and then at the very end of the book, they end up on a bluff out on the very edge of this 100-foot.
Excuse me. I'm sorry.
That's okay. Are you going to survive the whole interview?
I think so.
Okay. I think so. Yeah. So
I know. You know, I've been fighting this sinus infection and stuff for like pretty much the entire year, and it keeps yo-yoing on me. Today's not the best day, but
so the other scene that I wanted to see in the book is that out on the edge of this bluff by the moonlight with the Mississippi River shining, sparkling below them and fighting this horrible monster thing. And I'm like, I want to see that. I want to put that in my book. So
yeah. The other scene I think you were talking about that we'll just call a revenge scene.
Yes.
That scene was so gratifying.
Yeah. What's the movie I Spit on Your Grave? Was that the name of it? You know what I'm talking
Yeah,
about?
I know the movie. I've never gotten through it because that first
it's very similar to this portion of this book, and yes, the revenge, and the feeling of like the emotions that the character experiences from having been pushed to the point of feeling like they needed to do that. And that loss of humanity and all that. Yeah.
Well, and one of the similar thing to me, because we just recently watched it, have you seen the movie Death Proof?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like Death Proof in that regard, too.
Yes.
You know, the ending of that. And you just, I love Kurt Russell, but in that movie, you really like seeing Kurt Russell get his.
Yes. Yeah, that was delicious. That was a big delicious chunk of revenge porn, call it, or whatever.
Yeah. That's one of my wife's favorite movies. So
it's I think I like the second half. What was the Planet Terror?
I haven't seen that one.
Weren't they like? I thought they were connected together.
Like, I think they were released. Okay. It was like a double feature.
Yeah, because I saw them together.
Feature. But I've got the DVD of Death Proof just by itself.
Okay.
And I've never seen it. When we originally saw Death Proof, I think we saw it on TV somewhere, and it was just by itself. They didn't have the other half.
I hope it wasn't edited.
No, I don't think it was. I think it was on maybe Cinemax or HBO or something. Yeah. And then we liked that so much. So a few months ago, a lady's uncle died, and she posted something about he had this big collection of DVDs and wanted to know if anybody was interested in any. And I bought a stack of them from her, and she sent them to me, and that was one of them.
Huh. So we're rolling up on about an hour. Was there anything else you wanted to talk about in particular? Any other questions you think?
Nothing I can think of. How about you?
I think I've covered it. Read the books. They're awesome. They are just amazing. The author is so humble and such a wonderful person.
I was going to say one thing. I actually did an interview that I think is going up this weekend maybe for this People of Lovecraft podcast.
Yeah.
And one of the questions he asked was something about what if you were made a movie maker, if you were a movie maker and had whatever money and you could hire whoever you wanted for a project, what would you be doing? And I said, well, one would be my novel Wizard Song, and the other two, I said the others would be your series. So I mentioned it in there.
One of the things that I noticed when I wrote the first book was that I tried to keep the character count down, and in real terms, the special effects budget, call it that, wouldn't be that much. I think honestly, it could be done as a moderate budget, like $40 million or something, Which, yeah, just if you have 40 million laying around, just talk to me out. I'm here.
You need some serious CGI.
There for a couple scenes, but you know what? I
Yeah.
would very much prefer practical effects because they look so much better. They
Oh
hold
yeah.
up perfectly. And there was I'm trying to remember the movie called The Void. Maybe it came out a couple years ago. Had a
Yes.
lot of practical effects and it looked really good. And it's the same thing as like The Thing from the 80s or The Fly, back in that sort of grand era of really good visual effects that were practical in camera.
Have you
Uh,
seen Color Out of Space?
yes, yeah,
Yeah, they do some CGI like
yeah,
the grasshopper and
yeah,
stuff.
the bug thing,
There
yeah,
are some seriously good practical effects in there too.
yeah, yeah. And that's the thing is, I had considered going into graphic art. Well, I had gone to graphic art, but I'd considered going into special effects um, as a you know artist making latex masks and that sort of thing, and sort of things went a different direction. But it was as a kid I read Fangoria and I knew frequently how things were done, and still the thing is in a movie, like if you sit and study the props for 40 minutes, it's one thing, but in a movie you see it for 2 seconds, you know.
Oh yeah.
But yeah, if I did these as movies, I would do as much practical effects as possible because they just look so good. And shoot it here in St. Louis.
Well,
All this
obviously, because it needs to be done on location.
all this beautiful brick. This it's hard to explain how much brick is in St. Louis. It's just an enormous amount. I haven't had a chance to, like, I've been to Chicago, but I haven't had a chance to drive around sort of the, not the downtown, but the rest of the city all that much. But St. Louis, like, no matter where you go, if you're in the city proper, it's brick. It's the whole city is red. Like, it's crazy. So,
Well, as I say, with Chicago, people rave about the architecture in Chicago, and I mean, the skyscrapers. I've spent a lot of time in Chicago, but the skyscrapers are amazing. But
mhm.
to me, if you really want architecture, you go a little north to Milwaukee. That place has some amazing architecture.
Right, right.
It also has a horribly laid out road system. I get lost every time I go there. But
Yeah, yes. St. Louis can be a bit of a challenge if you get off the major belts. So,
yeah,
okay, I think I've covered everything. If you're good, we could call it a day, I
right.
think.
Let me just say, you can pick this up in paperback and hardcover right now just at lulu.com/spotlight/strange sound. Now, if you type that in, sometimes I get an error 404. But I think the reason might be you got to put the HTTPS on there. I think it's coming up as a non-secure, and maybe that's why it's erroring out. But at some point, it'll be on the. There'll be links to it on the Tales of Wonder and Dread page at GaryHillAuthor.com. Problem is, I'm having some issues with my web host today, and I haven't been able to update the page. They're working on it. I don't know when it'll get updated, but the Lulu link always works. And right now, the problem with Lulu is when with as many titles I've got, they come out at their order they were released. So the most recent are at top, which is great
Right.
right now for those. But in a year, those are going to be way down, and they're going to be hard to find on there, which
Yeah.
is why. So
This is if this QR code shows up, this is the QR code that will take you to all of the pieces on lulu.com that I am tagged in, including along with A Girl's Gotta Eat and Old Blackwater. There is Spooky Houses
Yep.
and Spooky Stories. Yep.
And you know what? That might be, what you just brought up might be the best way to find them if you're looking for them on Lulu. The best way to find them, go to lulu.com, go to the bookstore, and type in Elizabeth Lynn Blackson and do a search.
Yes.
And it should bring all of them up in
There
one
should
page.
be if you do that though, there might be a box at the very bottom that says show the restricted 18.
Oh, yeah, because those two are adults only.
There is, the A Girl's Got to Eat and Old Blackwater are very, 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 very adult. They are
Yeah,
very, very. There are bad words. There are bad things. There are bad ideas. It's
yeah, yeah. They would definitely be R-rated movies,
yes, at least.
at least, right? But yeah. So that's that as far as I'm concerned. Thanks for coming on here, and again, it's a pleasure to work with you on the books, and it really
Thank
is.
you. And
I
it
consider
was
you a
great.
friend, and I love working with you on these things.
Thank you. It's been great working with you too, and I'm looking forward to the third book and finishing at least the initial trilogy. And whether or not it continues from there is how much people love it. So,
And I'm open to it if you are. So,
yes.
all right. Talk to you later.
Talk to you later too.
Spooky Ventures is the home for spooky content and spooky merchandise on the web. Check it out today at spookyventures.com. And remember, always keep it spooky.